Hey, so I think we're at about time. Everybody able to hear okay? Awesome. So my name is Kevin Dierendorf. I run a blog called Mazer Patrol, and I wrote a book called Kaiju for Hipsters 101 Alternative Giant Monster Movies. So as you might have surmised from that description, I am a dude who has perhaps an unhealthy obsession with Japanese fantasy, sci-fi, and horror films. So I figured this might be a good topic to cover today because I recently had an experience that completely perplexed me. I went to the mall. There were 6 different stores at the mall that had Junji Ito merchandise, and I just could not wrap my hand around this because I've been a fan of his work for a very, very long time, but it's just everywhere now, and for a long time it was not. And what's also interesting to me is the stuff that you see from him recently is completely different from the stuff you would have seen if you were a fan, say, about 20 years ago. Because if you look at his old representation in the West, it would have been mostly from the movie side, the adaptations of his work. And nowadays I see most fans of his work kind of dismissing the adaptations out of hand and like, this isn't real Junji Ito. Junji Ito wouldn't approve of these things. And I found a quote from him where he basically says that he enjoyed himself quite a lot as a movie fan, and that it was like a dream for his comic to be turned into a movie. So I think that he appreciates them. I think if you're a fan of his work and you want to be holistic about it, it's worth looking at some of these adaptations. And not all of them are good, but not all of them, believe it or not, are bad. Some of them are actually worth checking out. So today we're going to cover a number of topics. We're going to talk about, this is a panel called movies, but we're going to talk about the movies that played in the theater, the stuff that went direct to video, the stuff that was made for television, streaming media projects. It's very sort of a broad term. We're going to talk about some lost stuff that was planned and never actually got made. But we're not going to talk about like the time he was on a talk show, or the time he watched a reaction video on YouTube, or the time when somebody made a fan film of his stuff, because, there's only so much time that we've got. Yep.
Ask people to move in so that we can have people to.
Sure. That better?
No. Can everybody move in so we get more seats?
Okay. Yeah, looks like there's standing room in the back, so everybody that's, if everyone can just move to the front. Sorry about that. If it helps empty the room out at all, I'll issue some warnings right now while people are moving around. This is Junji Ito. He makes creepy stuff. There will be creepy images. If you don't like creepy images, I suggest you don't watch this panel, because that's just kind of part of the ballpark. We're also going to be talking some spoilers. I'll try not to make it too heavy, but by nature of shocking imagery, a lot of it is going to kind of be things that you don't see coming. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And then, the last thing I got to say is we're going to talk about Tomie so much. There's just so much Tomie. She's everywhere. What's up?
It's not the point of it that there is an excessive amount of her.
Yes, that is exactly the point of Tomie. For anyone that doesn't know about Tomie, she's basically a human flatworm. So if you cut her in half, each piece grows back into a whole new person. It's great. So along those lines, let's get a little bit into who this Junji Ito fellow is, because you might have seen his stuff at Hot Topic and thought, well, that's weird. I don't know what that's all about. So just kind of a quick little rundown. He's probably the best known horror mangaka internationally right now. He's pervasive everywhere. He just won more Eisner Awards, so he's kind of also a representative. If you watch like Japanese television and they're talking about like, hey, we've got a new horror movie coming out. What does Junji Ito think about that? So he's now sort of the authority on horror. So he actually didn't start out as a mangaka. He was a dental assistant for a long time, and but he'd always been a fan of horror and horror manga. He was especially a fan of Kazuo Ume's. He thinks that The Drifting Classroom was like a masterpiece, and Shinichi Koga of Echo Echo Azarak. And I want you to remember those names because those are names that are going to come back later. He has a whole bunch of other influences like Hideshi Hino and Katsuhiro Otomo and Yasutaka Tsutsui, but he also speaks very fondly of watching Western horror movies on his television set. You know, things like the Universal horror, you know, Frankenstein with Boris Karloff, or Hammer horror films, and Evil Dead, Suspiria. The Exorcist, we said, was a big influence as well. So that's you're already seeing this like sort of cinematic influence coming through. So anyway, as a dental assistant, he was looking at this horror magazine that had a contest sponsored by Kazuo Ume's, his great hero, and he decided to submit a short story. So the magazine that he submitted it to was Monthly Halloween, and it was his favorite. And it was one that he continued to, once he was a published manga author, just submit stories to all the time, and most of his early work was published in Halloween until it stopped publishing in 1995. So this was a horror anthology. It's a shoujo horror anthology, which blows a lot of minds in the West. That they go, oh, girly stuff, what? I don't understand. But it's actually a lot of shoujo stuff is horror. And they did a lot of original stories, but they'd also do adaptations of popular horror films. So anyway, Junji Ito submits his story. It's a short story called Tomie, about a girl who dies and then shows up at school the next day and creeps everybody out. And he wins an honorable mention, and boom, we're off to the races. All of a sudden, he is a professional working manga artist. Immediately, he starts speculating, well, what if we did a movie about Tomie? And one of the jokes that he would make is like, we could cast all of these, you know, cute schoolgirls, and I get to come to the auditions and look at them. So if you think that it's weird that there was a whole dedicated horror manga anthology, I have news for you. There was a lot of horror stuff on the market in Japan in the 80s. These are all different dedicated horror magazines from the 1980s. And it was just part of the zeitgeist. The economy was really good, and video was a new thing. So with the home video market, there was just a huge influx, and people kept spending money on it. And unfortunately, what happens is in 1989, there's a famous serial killer who has a huge collection of anime and horror movies, and that brings a bad name onto the whole fan base. And that's why otaku was a dirty word in Japan for a long time. And you get basically something similar to what happened with the video nasty craze in the UK, where all of a sudden a bunch of studios that were going to make horror movies are like, oh, I know we said this was going to be a zombie movie, but what if it's a robot movie instead? So it kind of puts a damper on the transition from manga into movies. But there was one adaptation of Junji Ito's work that happened during this kind of low period for Japanese horror. And this is Dreadful Melody. It's an adaptation of Used Record. It's a story about a record that when people hear it, they get super obsessed with it, and then they're willing to kill one another just so that they can own that record. And this was done for a TV anthology series called Dramatis. It's a fairly faithful adaptation. It's just a half-hour, basically, TV episode. Think about it like an episode of The Twilight Zone, and it's something along those lines. No fan subs available for this one. It's only available on a DVD set for Dramatis in Japan. So that's the 90s for the most part, until something crawls out of the tube and kicks off a whole new boom for Japanese horror. Japanese horror after Ring came out is very different than it had been beforehand. You see a lot more emphasis on curses and investigation. Somebody's got to solve a mystery. There's something supernatural, and everything is very like spread virally. And this is actually very convenient because that's sort of Junji Ito's wheelhouse in his manga. With a popularity of titles like Ring internationally, a lot of studios want to invest in making this stuff. Even if it doesn't do well in Japan, they figure it could maybe take off in the West. And all of a sudden, floodgates are open. We get the J-horror New-Kaidan Boom. So, Ring came out in 1998. Immediately, Tomie is made into a movie. So we get our first adaptation in 1999, early in 1999, and this is actually weird as an adaptation because it's not a straightforward adaptation. It's a sequel to the manga, which has perplexed a lot of people because are there enough people that remember the manga from 1987 at this point that you can make a sequel? But evidently, it did well enough. So this is produced by Daiei, the studio that did Zatoichi and Gamera and Shall We Dance and a handful of other very successful titles. And it adapts some of the earliest Tomie stories. But it's definitely a little bit weird if you're going in expecting straightforward horror because it follows some of the tropes that you see in things like Ring. Namely, that the main villain, Tomie herself, doesn't show up until the final 20 minutes of the movie. It's mostly about your main character is one of Tomie's former classmates, kind of, who has amnesia from the PTSD and is just trying to figure out what happened back then. So the director has this quote here that he wanted to make it more like a drama for youth than a movie where people scream in fear, and that's a bold, controversial choice. So I think it rubs a lot of people the wrong way that you get this movie that's very, very slow, especially at the beginning. Though you do get some of the trademark Tomie influences from the manga. One thing that I do think is interesting here is you can see right up there, Tomie in the manga is very straight, and Tomie in the movies tends to be kind of queer, which I think is an interesting choice, and it's one that's pervaded throughout. Another change to the character from the manga is that you don't get much of her backstory, but in the movies it's always talked about how she's been doing this for hundreds of years and goes back to the Meiji period. That's always an interesting little detail to try to think about. I'd love to see like a Tomie movie set in samurai times. Anyway, this was successful and it spawned a franchise, and much like Doctor Who, where the main character keeps regenerating, you get a whole bunch of different Tomies, which might be jarring for some franchises, but because this character can take on so many different forms, it's actually kind of fun. And you get a lot of hullabaloo in the Japanese press whenever a new movie is announced, that they're like, oh, who's going to portray Tomie this time around? And you kind of, speculate about the newest idol that could jump into the role. So that's kind of a joy there. And when I say it was immediately successful, I mean immediately in that they made another movie the same year. This is a TV movie. It gets mentioned as a mini-series a lot, but all 3 half-hour segments were aired back to back to back, so it's a movie. And it kind of retells some of the stories that have already been told in the other movie, which is a little bit problematic. Because it's made for TV, the effects are not up there. The previous movie didn't have a lot of effects. When you do get effects, sometimes it's things like this weird like ghost cloud face, and you're just like, ooh, I don't know about that, guys. So if you're gonna skip one, this would be up there in the totem of perhaps don't bother with. But the TV train continued running because just a couple of months later, you get what was an early streaming series. So in the days of Netflix, it's easy to forget that, back in 2000, the idea of going on the internet and watching a TV show in real time streaming from a website was very novel. So I think it's fun to go back and speculate. This is how many made for streaming series were also released on VHS. I've got to know. It's that time period. So they made these were all made by Mikot, which was a studio that was really kind of looking to drum up interest in Junji Ito because they were working on an adaptation of Uzumaki, and they wanted to obviously have it be successful in Japan, but also successful in the West. They had looked at the success of movies like Audition in the West, and they were really kind of gaming for that market. But they wanted to, drum up interest in Japan as well. So they made several adaptations, and some of them are quite good. So we got the short stories Long Hair in the Attic, The Devil's Logic, and Hanging Balloons all adapted. And when these were released on VHS, it was in a collection just called Hanging Balloons. I got a note that The Devil's Logic was made by Takashi Shimizu, who went on to direct Ju-on and The Grudge. Surprisingly, I don't think that's the strongest of these adaptations, because the one by Issei Oda, who is mostly an effects guy, was the actual Hanging Balloons segment. And for a made-for-streaming low-budget thing from 2000, some of the CG actually doesn't look too terrible, which I was very impressed by. But we mentioned Uzumaki, so let's whirl right into it. Uzumaki, also known as Spiral, which in the year 2000 caused no end of confusion because there was a movie called Rasen, which also means Spiral, that was the sequel to The Grudge, so to The Ring. And if you just were trying to buy a copy via catalog and you're like, oh, I want that Japanese horror movie Spiral, you might wind up with the wrong one. So as mentioned earlier, this was made for simultaneous release both in the US and in Japan. It only played in San Francisco in theaters, unfortunately, but I appreciate the effort that they went to from that. So this was made by a Ukrainian-born Japanese dude named Higuchinsky. That's not his real name, but I think it's a great pseudonym. Effects by that guy Issei Oda that we mentioned before. Music, great music by the same composer that did the other video games like Earthbound. And this movie is actually available on DVD from Discotek. If you go on Amazon, it'll say new copy is going to charge you $100, but I was in the dealer's room earlier today and Discotek still has it at their table for $20. So if you're looking for completing your collection, I would advise going and checking it out there. This movie is also just an amazing collection of famous people from other horror films. It's almost like a best of the best because you get the reporter character from Ring Virus, who's also playing a reporter character. You get the girl who was Sadako in Rasen, which we mentioned earlier. Sadao Abe was the voice of Migi in the Parasite films. Ren Otsuki was the prime minister in Shin Godzilla, and then the main actress in this, Eriko Hatsune, would play in a lot of different Junji Ito adaptations. So we mentioned Hanging Balloons earlier, but in the same year, she would also feature in Long Dream and Oshikiri. So this is quite the film. I'm very partial to it. And the director said something I find remarkable, that he said he wanted to make something like Star Wars, but realized because he was Japanese that he should do something different. So this was his thoughts of, let's make something like Star Wars and then completely not like Star Wars. And actually to prepare for making the movie, he had everybody watch this detective movie from the 70s, The Devil's Ballad, which is absolutely nothing like Star Wars, so I have no idea what he was going for, but he's quite the character. As an adaptation, though, I've got to say, he stuck really quite close to the source material. The only downside, I would say, is that it doesn't adapt the entirety of the Uzumaki manga, because if you think about this, this was released in the year 2000, and the Uzumaki manga was going up until 1999, so they had to get started making this movie before the manga was completed. So the whole completely over-the-top ending of the Uzumaki manga isn't represented, but some people like that, some people don't like that. It's a movie that kind of gets to a point and stops. So you can go with that or not. I think that the strength of it is so much of this town just beset by spirals, which I'm sorry if I didn't explain to anybody who doesn't know about Uzumaki. The villain of Uzumaki is the concept of spirals, which is just watching this as a Japanese horror fan in the 2000s was really eye-opening, and it was such a hard sell, I think, for a lot of people when you're used to more straightforward concepts like girl comes out of the TV and kills you, or girl comes out of the ceiling and kills you, or girl comes out of the bathtub and kills you. There's so many different things that can kill you, and they're all whirly spiral things. So, would recommend checking out the Uzumaki movie. It's been released here a couple of times, but most recently by Discotheque. On double feature with Uzumaki, when it played in theaters in Japan, was a sequel to Tomie called Tomie Replay. This adapts a slightly later part of the manga, which is the hospital arc and basement. So the idea is that somebody comes into the hospital who's had a kidney transplant. The kidney transplant was from Tomie, and of course a whole new Tomie grows from the kidney transplant, and it's really unsettling. Meanwhile, you have a girl who is kind of investigating why everybody in the hospital is like going crazy from this, and it hits a lot of the tropes that you'll see in Japanese horror from that perspective. So this one really ramps up the body horror in the franchise, but unfortunately it was a bit of a box office flop. And I don't know if that was because of the length with combining this with Uzumaki, or if one of those was simply not to the taste of the Japanese audiences at the time, but it's got a lot to offer just in terms of the sheer visuals, and apparently Junji Ito liked it enough that he did illustrations for the novelization, which it's fun to think that this was, while on one hand close enough, it was also different enough that it got its own novelization that was apart from the source manga. Mikot did a little bit more stuff on the Junji Ito series in the year 2000 with a half-hour anthology series. So it adapted 4 different stories: Long Dream, Oshikiri, Face Burglar, and Gravemarker Town. Of those, Long Dream is actually available in the States. Oshikiri was made available as a movie while it was playing on TV, which I can't understand why somebody would go to the movies instead of watching it on TV, or, it's a strange decision. And then Gravemarker Town is notable in that it was aired on TV, but apparently nobody recorded it, and now there's no copies out there. So, Long Dream, I think, might be one of the better known short stories by Junji Ito. It's about a guy who goes to the hospital and says that he's having really long dreams, and every night he dreams a dream that lasts a day, and then a week, and then a year, and then hundreds of years, and then thousands of years. So when he wakes up, he's basically no longer human again, every single night. The movie adapts that for the first half of it, after which it kind of turns into a more conventional horror movie because they probably ran out of source material, and we're like, well, we can't just have half an hour of this, it's so good. So they just kind of make up a more sort of hackneyed horror story out of it, which I'm not too much of a fan of, but the visuals of it, again, by Higuchinsky, the same guy that directed Uzumaki, are fantastic. And it's Issei Oda also on those effects, and I just love the way that those illustrations are rendered in the movie itself. So this one, as I said before, is available on DVD in the States. Oshikiri is also known as Partition or Oshikiri the Strange Story. So this one was released as a movie, as I said before, in the theaters while it was airing on TV in individual segments. And it was like they aired the first segment, then they released the movie in theaters, and then they released the rest of the segments that same month, which I don't understand. So this story is about a character who has a doppelganger who's living in his house and sort of stalking his friends. And this is not a super close adaptation, but has some elements that are similar to the manga. The stalker character wears this gas mask, as you can see up there, which is not from the manga, but I kind of like it because it gives it this very like sort of Jason Voorhees slasher vibe, as opposed to the perhaps more creepy version where it's just he sees himself all the time, but this is more of a big reveal when the mask comes off and it's his own face underneath. For fans of Japanese fantasy stuff, I would say look out because this has Eisei Amamoto in it, who was Doctor Who in King Kong Escapes and Dr. Death in Kamen Rider and a whole bunch of other. He was a toy maker in Godzilla's Revenge, a classic actor from the 60s who continued acting up through the 2000s. And Tomoro Taguchi, I didn't mention he was in the original Tomie, but he's best known as Tetsuo the Iron Man. So now we're into the year 2000, and the Tomie train keeps on running in the theaters. And we get another adaptation. These are from 1995. So that's, if you remember, Gekkan Halloween stops publishing in 1995. So these are some of the last Tomie stories that had been published before the movie started. And this is directed by our friend Takashi Shimizu, who we mentioned before, of The Grudge. And as a result, it is fantastic. And this is one of the best regarded films in the Tomie franchise. What he introduces, he tries to really give you whiplash between Tomie is human and when she's not human, when she's acting like somebody that you can relate to, and when that switch goes off and she's just a complete monster. And then another hallmark of Shimizu is his dark comedy. So one of the scenes that a lot of people point out to that like, oh, this is kind of creepy, but it's also kind of funny is the scene where the Tomie has been killed by this boy's mother because she was so upset about him bringing home this strange woman who was rude to her, and now they're hacking up the body in the bathroom, just talking about like, what a good day today was. And then when she comes back, inevitably creeping after them, she's this weird little creature where it's just a severed head with two hands, and it's like following them down the street in a chase sequence like that. And that's another thing that's like, it's creepy, but it's also kind of funny. Released the same day as Tomie Re-birth, but not somehow on a double feature. I don't know if this just means we're reaching critical mass of how much J-horror was being released at the time. We got The Love Ghost, which is an adaptation of the short story Boy at the Crossroads. This is kind of a problematic one because it only adapts The Boy at the Crossroads when, if you've read Love Sickness, you know that's a 5-chapter storyline, and this only takes the very broadest sense of the boy that tells your future when you meet him at Crossroads, and he always, does a monkey's paw thing where he'll tell you some dark future and then it drives you crazy. So this one is written by Naoyuki Tomomatsu, who is best known as a zombie guy, and he's done stuff like Stacy, Bite Me If You Love Me, and the infamous Lust of the Dead series. So if you've seen any of his stuff, you know that this guy is completely insane, and unfortunately, this movie does not live up to it. It's kind of boring, and I'm like, why is nobody using chainsaws all the time for no reason? What is good that came out of it is that this is the movie that resulted in that Love Sickness short story actually getting compiled into a manga volume for sale in Japan. This one is not available in the US, and that might be for the better. This is Kakashi. It's based on scarecrows and on Grave Marker Town loosely, and loosely just in the sense that these are both things about people turn into scarecrows. And it kind of, as a, the manga story is much more, cathartic about, oh, you plant a scarecrow on a grave site, and then you can see your dead relative turn into it. And this is more like the Wicker Man, where somebody's like investigating a disappearance. I mean, it's written by the same person that wrote Tomie Replay, and it's a similar deal where, oh, I have this journal from somebody that's disappeared. I'm going to find out what the deal was with that. And it turns into kind of like the kind of like a cult horror film. So if you think about like the Wicker Man, it's this town has a ceremony where they turn people into scarecrows, and it doesn't really line up with the manga very well at all, which is again why people are like, this is kind of like scarecrows. It could be all sorts of different adaptations. This is directed by the director of Ring Zero, which is one of the better Ring movies, but this one doesn't do much for me personally. So we are all out of Tomie manga from the original run of the manga series, as we mentioned before. So it's time for the, quote, final chapter. Anybody who is a fan of the Friday the 13th series knows that when a movie is called the final chapter, it's not the final chapter, but let's pretend this is the final chapter. If nothing else, this is the last movie from Daiei, because the company Daiei actually was sold right after this. They were with Tokuma Shoten, and they were sold to Kadokawa, so they stopped making Tomie movies after this. And it's a completely original story as opposed to the prior ones. And this is quite the whirlwind. It's called Forbidden Fruit in the West for this reason. This is a story about a love triangle between Tomie, another girl who's named Tomie but isn't the same Tomie, and that girl's father. So the idea is that this guy, 25 years ago, he was obsessed with Tomie so much that when he had a daughter of his own, he named her Tomie, and then because Tomie is an immortal, she winds up running into that same girl 25 years later, and it's just as skeevy as it sounds. The father in this is played by Jun Kunimura, who, if you have seen a Japanese movie, you probably have seen Jun Kunimura. It's throw a dart and odds are he is in it. Again, I mentioned the queerness factor of Tomie in the movies, and this is definitely the highest. So if you are looking for that, but again, Tomie is a monster, so don't expect anything moving or very heartstring tugging, because she is just as likely to snap and be like, hey, we were having a romance, but what if I had you killed? So now, critics both in the West and in Japan have noted some similarities between this and the movie series Basket Case, in that the Tomie, when she's cut into pieces, she's regenerating, and then she has this, in this case, the other Tomie carrying her around in a bag. It's very similar to the movie Basket Case, where this guy has his brother who's a deformed creature that he carries around in a basket, and there's actually similarities throughout the Tomie series. So while these two images at the bottom are from Forbidden Fruit, the large one on top there is from the first Tomie movie, and then we have one from Rebirth. And people are like, oh, would Junji Ito have even been aware of Basket Case? And I say yes, because as I mentioned, Halloween, the monthly magazine, actually had a cover story on Basket Case, as you can see here, where they had original photo shoots, and Junji Ito has a short story in that very magazine, Deserter, which is coming soon from Viz. So speaking of strange little creatures, let's go to Marronnier, and this is unfortunately one I had to edit for the sake of our panel, but you can guess what the original version of that DVD cover looked like. This is a loose adaptation of Marionette Mansion and Hella the Doll Funeral, and I say loose in the sense that both of these are things about somebody who kidnaps people and turns them into dolls or marionettes. This is not one of the more popular ones with a lot of J-horror fans because it's more sort of gory and explicit, and that's exactly why I love it. But it's an interesting one in that this is one of the few titles that was available in the US and actually is not available on DVD in Japan. This was made by a small studio called Atelier Koganemushi, and they're best known nowadays. They have a really cute, adorable Godzilla puppet show on YouTube. But at this point, they were kind of really underground, but somehow they reached out to Junji Ito, and he was game for participating in this movie with, you know, grotesque puppets that were attacking people. And Junji Ito actually has a cameo. He has two cameos in this movie, and one of those cameos is in the form of a puppet, as you can see there. So we're starting to slow down with the wave of adaptations at this point, and we get to Groaning Drain, which is a story about a family that sort of spurs the advances of this creepy guy, and then he worms his way up the drain to terrorize them. And this is directed by Ataru Oikawa, who did the original Tomie movie, and this is where well, frankly, all of the respect that I had based on that first Tomie movie really starts to chip away, because this is terrible. It's very brightly written. It's almost comedic. The cinematography is terrible. The special effects are, well, I mean, you can see this is somebody being pulled down the drain, and I looked it up, and none of the people who did special effects on this have ever done any special effects on any other movie ever. Yeah, it kind of fails as a horror movie entirely. So I would like it if that meant that maybe Ataru Oikawa didn't work on the Junji Ito adaptations anymore, but of course that means that he did. So yeah, following that, he got two more movies out, starting with Tomie the Beginning. So if you've already had the final chapter, of course you go back and you do a prequel, and this is where it's convenient that, oh, we never actually adapted the very first story of the manga. So this movie takes place at a school reunion where everybody's like, hey, remember that time when there was a monster and she like drove all of our class to be crazy and kill one another? So that's the premise of this one. And as I mentioned before, this is no longer made by Daiei. Instead, they went to Tsuburaya Entertainment, who is not to be confused with Tsuburaya Productions, the studio that makes Ultraman. This is sort of another studio by a relative of those guys. So it's really kind of cheap and not very entertaining. And even this is a 70-minute long movie, but you will feel kind of that it drags. So I would not necessarily recommend checking out Tomie the Beginning, which was hastily produced. And how hastily produced was it? Well, this opened in cinemas in a limited theatrical release April 9th, 2005. And the next week, there was another Tomie movie in the theater already. by the same director. So he was perhaps spreading himself a little bit thin on that front. The Revenge is nominally an adaptation of the Revenge story from the manga. It's a very loose adaptation. The big, similarities are that this is also a story where Tomie is in the wilderness, and you do get a scene where she eats a dude. So if you're looking for that sort of thing, that's some good creep factor there. But otherwise, this is considered sort of quite the low point in the franchise. So neither the beginning nor the Revenge would be on my recommendation list. Now, while I was researching, I found something really interesting, and this is a potential lost project, something that was intended to be made that maybe was intended to be made and maybe wasn't. Because Noboru Iguchi, who is he's the guy that directed movies like The Machine Girl and Dead Sushi and Zombie Ass. I talked to one of the actors who was in one of his movies, and he said, "That's a weird dude, you probably shouldn't watch his movies." So he posted on his blog in March of 2007 that they were doing auditions for a Tomie versus Echo Azarak movie. And he described it as being like War of the Gargantuas, which is it's a classic Japanese monster movie about two brothers that are pitted against each other. So, but I kind of wonder, was this something that was serious? Would he have done auditions for a movie as an April Fool's Day joke? Maybe. He's a weird dude. I don't know. But what I do think holds up about this are a couple of factors. First of all, Noboru Iguchi actually did wind up directing a Tomie movie down the road that we'll get to. Secondly, Echo Azarak was a big influence on Junji Ito. He's a big fan, as we mentioned before. And thirdly, while we didn't get Tomie versus Echo Azarak, the next movie was Tomie versus somebody. It just so happened that somebody was also Tomie. So as a concept, I really like this because you have this character that's constantly being killed and growing back, and every piece of her grows into a new version of herself. So of course they would come into conflict with each other. And this was a time period where you were getting these movies like Freddy versus Jason and Alien versus Predator and so on and so forth. So it's natural that you have a versus movie. This is the final Tsuburaya Entertainment adaptation, and I think it's the best of them. It's an adaptation of The Gathering from 2000, so this is a story that was done after the movies had actually started coming out. But I don't think that it's that manga story isn't one of the better ones. It's about, Tomie has a whole cult of dudes that are obsessed with her, and then one guy sort of gets looped into the cult, and he's not obsessed with her for, some reason, and she kind of like can't deal with that. While the manga doesn't, the manga makes it, oh, he's still, in love with his dead girlfriend or whatever. I like the twist at the end of this version, which is actually there's even more Tomie that comes out of him. So that's part of the whole reveal at the end. So we've been through a whole bunch of Tomie movies at this point, and it got me thinking, like, well, all of the big Japanese horror franchises, The Ring, Dark Water, Pulse, The Grudge, One Missed Call, they all got these Hollywood remakes in the 2000s, and Tomie is a major franchise in Japan, probably the biggest one that hasn't ever been adapted. And there were several more that were planned, but turns out Tomie was on the table. Now, why this didn't happen, I think there's a lot of possibilities. It's kind of a difficult sell in that this isn't a monster that kills anybody directly. She just kind of makes people crazy and has them kill for her or kill one another for her, or so on and so forth. And it's kind of, maybe, I don't want to cast any stones, but it could be read kind of misogynistically, so that's something that could be viewed as problematic for a lot of audiences. So I can see why Hollywood might have been averse, but they didn't talk about it. Tomie was optioned by Dimension Films, who were doing big movies at this time, like Grindhouse and The Mist. And at first, they went with these comedy writers. They had Philip Wen of Spin City, and then a duo, Vince DiMeglio and Tim Ramesen, who had recently worked on Marmaduke. So I can't imagine the whiplash that you'd have going from Marmaduke to Tomie, but more power to them. We've seen weirder stuff in Hollywood. So this was just kind of briefly reported on, and the synopsis that was given for this version sounded very much like an adaptation of that first Tomie movie, where a police investigator was looking into a series of murders of a girl named Tomie, and like, why is there this series of murders that's all the girl with the same name? That's kind of weird. Find the root of it. So that didn't happen, but Hollywood kept on plugging along, and at some point, Paul Schrader was brought on board to do an adaptation. And that's weird because he's not really a horror movie guy, but he's a very well-known, very well-respected screenwriter for, he did 4 different movies with Scorsese and stuff. So Raging Bull and Taxi Driver are kind of some of, if you ask movie people, like, the best movies ever made, that's something that kind of boggles the mind to imagine him on this J-horror adaptation. But this one, I have this quote from Bloody Disgusting when it was announced. So described as a supernatural fatal attraction, when a young man brings his fiancée home for the first time, his father is stunned. She's the same girl that he loved and killed 25 years ago. Now she wants him back. Tomie pits father against son in a deadly battle for her love. And like, this is forbidden fruit, only straight washed. I don't know. This is kind of like, but would this have been more successful with the Western audience? Possibly, but it's one of those great what ifs that we'll never know exactly how it could have been, but it's fun to imagine about. Now, we got a little bit more Tomie to go. So we mentioned Noboru Uguchi again. He did get to make his Tomie movie, and it was with Toei, who is a real studio, and he teamed up with Yoshihiro Nishimura, who is known for the Machine Girl and similar sort of splattery films like this. And this period in 2011, they were at the peak of their game because American studios are pumping out lots of money for things like Sushi Typhoon and Tokyo Shock type of over-the-top splattery Japanese gore films, and this delivers on this. This is the most violent, ridiculous entry in the Tomie series by a mile. This is the only one that's gotten an R15 certificate in Japan, which is considerably more restrictive than you would get from a comparable certificate in the States. What I think is kind of funny about this is Iguchi said that he considers this a companion piece to his movie Karate Robo Zaborger, which was made the same year. And when asked to elaborate on that, he's like, well, that movie is about 2 brothers, and this movie is about 2 sisters, so kind of the same thing. So this is a full reboot, and then Tomie, and this is a sister of your main character who dies and comes back again and again and again. And every schlocky, ridiculous permutation that you can think of, including as sushi. She is made into food, and she comes back as bugs. And if you're looking for something that is creepy, like the original movies with the Shimizu stuff, you're not going to necessarily find that here. But if you're looking for something that's over the top and ridiculous, this is quite possibly the one for you. And I think that makes a lot of sense because this Junji Ito stuff frequently is ridiculous. In 2011, we got an adaptation of Red Turtleneck, which is a manga from 2013. Do the math, see how that works out. How did the director of this know that there was going to be this Junji Ito manga in the future? Well, the director of this was Junji Ito. So this is a story about a guy whose head has been cut off, and he has to walk around holding his head in his hands so that it doesn't come apart from his body. This was done as a 3-part project, and each was with a major horror mangaka. And one of them was Shinichi Koga for an Echo Azarak movie, where he directed that. So you got basically your three different horror mangaka directing a movie. We're going to run through some more of these pretty quickly now. We finally got anime. I know, we've been talking all this time for live action. Gyo was adapted into an anime in 2012. It was an OVA. It was kind of a loose, well, it wasn't a loose adaptation, but it stripped a lot of the subtext from the original manga. Once those doors were open, we started getting some more slightly animated stuff. We got an Uzumaki web series that was basically a motion comic with some color added. And we got an adaptation of the Earthbound made for TV with a bunch of other segments, but one of those segments was based on something by Kazuo Umez. So finally, Junji Ito and Kazuo Umez got to get together and work on something together. I'm sure that was a big goal of his. He was involved with Partner in Darkness in 2015. All he really did with this is a TV series about a murder mystery where it's a cold case, but there's details about the murder that are in a manga, so the detectives are looking at the manga in order to get details about that. Junji Ito provided the manga for that, so you see a lot of times people are like, oh, why hasn't this manga been translated? Like, well, it doesn't really make sense without the TV series. Another lost project was the Rib Woman. So this is about a woman who gets addicted to plastic surgery. This was announced started filming in Beijing in 2016, and since then nothing has really come out of it. So this should have been released already if it was a web movie, but there's been no announcement that it's been canceled, and if they actually did start shooting, which we have film from set, it's kind of strange that they dropped it without announcing anything. Sort of the final stretch that we've got here is that Junji Ito started to take off in America towards the mid 2010s. So you start getting these fancy hardcovers, and you start getting memes. Memes are very important to his popularity here, and finally there's a widespread acceptance, and because of that, that's when you start to get co-productions, because American companies, they notice, oh, this thing is hot, let's pour money into it. So that's when you get Crunchyroll sponsoring the Junji Ito Collection, which is a series of 12 episodes and 2 OVAs. Each episode is 2 short stories. You can get this on Blu-ray from Funimation also. And you get a whole bunch of the stories that we had previously mentioned adapted in animated form. So it's fun to go back and watch both of these side by side, and also read the manga and kind of see who did which version better. And Ito himself is quite fond of some of the choices for these in terms of the music and pacing, which I know it was controversial. A lot of his fans did not like the anime. In addition to those stories that had been adapted before, we got some stories in the Junji Ito Collection anime series that had never been adapted, including all of the Soichi stories, which is this little creepy dude who loves to try to curse people and fails miserably at it. This, I think, part of the reason why people didn't respond that well to this series is that those are very comedic segments, and those hadn't really been exposed to a lot of Western viewers before. So they kind of went in expecting straight up horror, and then they got these like really goofy comedic scenes. Also, the Slug Girl is one that's pervasive everywhere after this anime series came out, and I think that's really just because they didn't have the rights to Uzumaki. Just a couple more to get through. There's a potentially, maybe, kind of lost project. There's a streaming service, Quibi, which they had the bright idea of let's have episodes that are only 5 minutes long because Generation Z has no attention span or some other nonsense. And they obviously failed. But the director for this, Alexandre Aja, was going to make a Tomie series for Quibi, and according to his latest statements, it sounds like they're going to still maybe go ahead with something. I'm really curious to see this because short stories, this could be very interesting. You know, Junji Ito writes his stuff in short story form. If you watch something like Uzumaki, it kind of comes across as a collection of vignettes, so these short form stories might be perfect for adaptation. We've also got On the Horizon coming from Adult Swim, an adaptation of Uzumaki. This is only 4 episodes. That makes me a little bit nervous, considering that the one that was like done as a webcomic was 19 episodes. So we'll see how this turns out. We've seen a few trailers for it. They're going completely black and white to make it look slavishly like the original manga. I don't know if that's necessarily the right move, considering that a lot of the art in the manga was full color, but more power to them if it works out. Aside from that, Junji Ito's had a lot of collaborations with different Western movies from Spain, France, Mexico, Italy, and the US even. So most recently he did an adaptation of The Lighthouse, which is the Robert Ecker movie with Willem Dafoe. He's had a lot of influence around the world. We've seen, you know, elements of his manga showing up. Secret Tears in Korea and Girl from Nowhere from Thailand are examples of sort of Tomie-ish stuff in modern media. And then everybody loves the Amigahara fault meme being represented in Steven Universe. So on that note, I think we're just about at time, but if you want the rundown of stuff I would say you check out, look for Uzumaki, Tomie Unlimited, Long Dream, Tomio, Tomie Re-birth, Marronnier, and Tomie Forbidden Fruit. Keep in mind all of the caveats that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, we got 1 minute. I'll be around.